You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our Dinner and Dialogue gathering on October 16th, 2024. Thanks for tuning in. So, I want to begin our conversation tonight by calling back a quote from earlier in our dialogues in week 2. Namely, that the author Adrienne Maree Brown said that our fear is actually rooted in the reality that we do not believe in our own complexity. It's almost as if this one thing is at the heart of the societal challenges we're facing today. Namely, that we have huge struggles upholding nuance in our conversations. And we have even more difficulty acknowledging if there's a little bit of truth on both sides. And because of this, we end up wrestling with our society's othering impulses, because in our lack of being able to hold and believe in a more complex reality, it forces us to strengthen our in-group borders and push the out-groups we don't identify with farther away in the process. So tonight I want to hone in on this invitation to hold multiple truths, which, if we can learn to do this well, will stop us from doing a couple of things. Namely, shaming others and playing the victim ourselves. I don't think it'd be incorrect to say that on both the American political left and right, folks are striving for what, in their minds, are a moral high ground. It's literally in our evolutionary biology to act in ways that live out what we feel is right. And some of the core questions that are related to our moral actions are around our deep desires to know that we are ultimately okay, that we are ultimately good and beloved. And in specific situations, what are we to do when we don't feel this way? What are we to do when we are carrying feelings of failure or shame? And consequently, what are we supposed to do when we feel like others aren't acting according to our convictions of what is good and just and loving? It's a basic human fact that we all want to hold to an identity that keeps us morally pure, escaping any and all critiques that would say otherwise, and we look to form communities that will keep us pure as well. But here's the problem I often observe. No one can stand under the weight of their own moral purity. And in fact, moral purity only furthers supremacy culture by upholding one demographic's goodness over another. Whether that's racialized, genderized, classicized, politicized, religious, etc. All you have to do is spend 2 minutes on Facebook or 30 seconds on Twitter or the news to see our society function to other those who aren't on the moral high ground that we are. So much of our moral discourse from both sides continues to be about shaming one another into submission. It's this punitive tendency that we've been discussing. And it seems that we haven't yet figured out how to transfigure this modus operandi within our culture of othering. But tonight, I want to paint you a picture so hopefully we can see these dynamics more clearly and in turn change the way we operate within it. So I'll start by saying that the difficult conversations we have around morality and politics are generally for the purpose of drawing us closer to the heart of justice, equality, and equity. And I want to give every person, no matter their background or their opinion, the benefit of the doubt, that most of us have good motivations or good intentions. It's just that the terms of engagement in our culture right now seem to prop up the idea that if you aren't with me, you're against me. If you don't agree with me, you don't have a place to speak. If you aren't seeing what I'm seeing in terms of the arc of morality, then to hell with you. But here's the secret. When we shout our own morality or accuse others of immorality, the result is that we often end up carrying shame because we can't recognize that we are morally complex people and that we usually have mixed intentions and are not morally pure in the ways we wish or we pretend we are, or wish others were. And the problem is, when we're in this cycle, the more we end up craving innocence and want to separate ourselves from anyone or any community or system that generates shame for us. It's from our deep goodness that we desire to be in communities that are morally sound. And yet, if we're not careful, we can project our shame of our moral imprecision onto others, and in turn, create a purity cult that keeps us from actually transforming the systems that oppress us. Here's the way I've seen this play out in my own experience. So for years, I struggled with feeling like I was a victim of a lot of things. Maybe certain aspects of my family life, my cancer diagnosis, or maybe being a victim of a certain kind of church culture. And on some level, I was really hurt by some of those things. I had trauma that I needed to work through, and I still work on integrating that, in fact. But here's what I also saw, that when I felt like the victim, with all the shame, etc., that comes with that, it's so easy to project that on other people. When my hurt was not yet transformed, it could be transmitted by continuing to play the victim and isolating myself from others who didn't see it the way I did. So here's what I wonder about. I wonder if some of us continue to live from our ego by playing the victim in a more subtle and insidious way. Namely, by saying that everyone whose moral opinion doesn't mirror my own doesn't have a place in the conversation. Have you not seen this on both the left and the right? Each side believes they're the pure ones, and while there should be room for real, respectful discussion about what is moral and what rights should belong to people in a democracy and addressing things like inequity and inequality and all of that, most of what we see is a purity performance on both sides that actually keeps us from deepening the conversation and transforming our life together. You see, sometimes we think there's a shortcut to innocence. And there's this unusual contemporary phenomenon of playing the role of a victim where no one else is as pure as we are. And I can recognize that maybe for some of us, this is not our issue, right? Maybe for some of us, the shame we throw is actually at ourselves. Or maybe shame isn't a core issue for you at all. But in any respect, here's why I'm bringing this up in the context of a series of conversations around medicine for this moment. The victim shame paradigm kills community. It further pulls us apart. It makes us further unable to hold our own complexity and keeps real relationship difficult across our differences. So the kind of complexity I'm hoping we can embody is illustrated by Britt Barron in her new book, Do You Still Talk to Grandma? She writes this: there have been times in all of our lives where we have behaved more like a hero and other times when we've played the villain. We have all been hurt and we have all hurt. We have all loved and we have all broken a heart or two. We have fought for healing and reconciliation and we have all sought revenge. We slide up and down the moral spectrum, but the spiritual and emotional space where we are freed from false binaries and false choices is the space where we can learn how to be human. We are complex people. And if we can learn to stop playing purity games and recognize our own moral complexity, perhaps another invitation might begin to emerge for us from deep within our honesty. Maybe it's the invitation of the reconnecting medicine of mercy. You know, this reminds me of Luke's translation of that phrase from the Sermon on the Mount. If you remember, Matthew 5 says, "Be perfect as God is perfect." So let's say we applied that to this conversation tonight in the context of perfect moral performance. That would be impossible, right? We just acknowledged with Britt Barron that there's a tension around our imperfection. But Luke's translation says, "Be merciful as God is merciful." And then in the next breath says, "Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you." What a novel idea, right? If it's not about purity games and performing our morality perfectly, what is the emerging invitation? To be merciful. What if forgiveness, non-judgmentalism, and generosity are what we began to extend to others with whom we differ? Now we're cooking. So what if our goodness isn't attached to our moral performance? Does that mean we shouldn't act morally? No, of course not. We all have a moral imperative to relieve suffering where it's possible, in so much as it's in our power to do so. But if our goodness is grounded somewhere else, in something more intrinsic, like, say, the fact that you exist at all, then it's not up for debate. And we can have permission to be gracious rather than shaming. We can have permission to be complex rather than playing the victim when others aren't like us. We can have permission to let our life together be messy and beautiful and healing, which is the way it actually is. Perhaps then, if we can move out of the modus operandi of our cultural othering, we can begin to realize that shaming the other side only leads to further fragmentation, not deepening community. And if we cease aiming at the people whose morality differs so starkly from ours, we can point out the real struggles that we're entangled with. I think the author Carlos Rodriguez says it best. He says the target is not Christians, it's Christian nationalism. The target is not men, it's patriarchy. The target is not white people, it's white supremacy. The target is not heterosexuals, it's homophobia. And he goes on to say, if we can learn not to take it personal, meaning not to get into the games of victim and shame and othering that we've been talking about tonight, then we can join the work of dismantling the oppressive systems that we're wrestling with. But you know what I also hear so clearly in this? People are not the targets. People are not targets. You know, sometimes I want to blame people, don't you? It feels good to be like, no, you actually are the problem. And, you know, I think that's another way that we justify ourselves, because I'm rarely the problem, right? But the temptation to throw shame and blame at each other will always be there. But indicting each other over moral issues is not necessarily the answer. We have to learn to claim our deep complexity anew. My hope is that we can begin to see that we are morally complex people who, in good faith, are looking to build a better world. So I hope tonight that each of us can consider the invitation to move away from victimizing ourselves as holy and just and suffering for our cause, and the shaming of others who aren't as holy and just as we are. That cycle only furthers supremacy culture, and it keeps us divided. And we must remember that each of us across the table from one another tonight are not the targets. No matter what we've done, no matter what we've said or continue to wrestle through on the path toward justice and peace. We have got to uphold our complexity in such a way that mercy becomes our lens for dealing with difference and invites us into constructive conversations about how we can move forward toward a more beautiful, equitable, and just future together. Let's talk about this. Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.